in flow as a team, you collaborate beautifully. Time just seems to fly. You actually get things done and you can focus intensely. Well, that is the subject of our conversation, and I would like to pull up the gentleman that'll be guiding that conversation. Please welcome Daryl Etherington to the stage. Let's give him a hand.
Hello, hi everybody. Yeah, that's a good intro. I have to say I'm not usually in a state of flow. I'm usually in a state of extreme chaos and confusion, but our next guest's product has helped me achieve flow on rare occasions. So let's welcome to the stage Alex Hood, who is the Chief Product Officer at Asana. All right, so I don't know if you heard that, but that is accurate. I'm usually freaking out. I've got a lot of notifications going on, digital journalists, so many machines buzzing with lots of lights and sounds.
Sure.
How does Asana think about this problem? How do you help people kind of get out of that? You are providing more buzzes and notifications, right?
Well, the way that we think about it is there's 1 billion information workers out there, and according to our research and some research done by McKinsey, information workers spend 60% of their time doing work about work. Can anybody relate to that? Yeah, it's the status updates, it's trolling from email to see like the last plan of record, the last attachment that was the thing, looking back through your Slack messages to see what the current status of things is. That stuff is kind of soul crushing. Like nobody went to college or nobody trained for their trade to do work about work. But that is the next place where, if done well, we can reform how we work, we can change how we work, use different tools, where we can greatly reduce the amount of effort it actually takes to collaborate and become more efficient. We track collaboration, and we do that by just measuring number of messages back and forth that it takes to get something done. That's increasing exponentially. Then you actually look at productivity, and that is increasing at a much lower rate, flatline single digits. So that just means it's taking more back and forth for us instead of less to get the same amount of stuff done. So, gosh, that's a problem. I mean, that just shows that there's a lack of clarity of who's responsible, like who's doing what by when. How do we track the things that were going on? And then a lot more pressure to always be giving status updates on things. So what Asana does is it just makes it super clear. Like who's responsible for what? What's the current plan of record? What's the context of the work? So you don't have to be tapped on the shoulder by somebody every 2 minutes to give a status update. It's all just right there. You can see how your work contributes to the greater good of the company. So it's just a different way to work. Are there any Asana users out there?
It's gotta be, yes.
Yeah, right.
Lots.
Good.
So you mentioned their collaboration is increasing, but then that's sort of tied to flat productivity or flat?
Yeah, it's just increasing single-digit percentage.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. So how does that square with? I think we hear a lot about encouragement for collaboration in the workplace, right? And it's a value for a lot of companies, a lot of tech companies, and a lot of companies that are moving from the startup phase into like the larger organization phase. So how do you square that with that kind of value? How do you explain to organizations, or how do you work with organizations to get them to understand that collaboration is not necessarily always a virtue?
Yeah, collaboration is not always a virtue. In fact,
is that true?
It takes us about 10 apps per person to do our job. And they all have their own notification systems. A lot of them don't share data or talk to each other. So it just means like you get pinged on a lot of different ways. And some of the research that we've done has shown that the number one reason that you have to stay late at work is because you got pinged. Or that there's a new email exchange that you have to do a status update on. I'm seeing some smiles in the crowd. Yeah, that doesn't have to be that way. Like imagine if your boss can just go and kind of go in and in a way, non-threatening way, get clarity on where all your work stands. So collaboration is, the virtue of it is a team actually can feel like it's in flow state. Like if you've seen the Brazilian soccer team play, it's almost like a dance. They can kind of play off each other. I'm sure you all have experiences as well of being on a team where it's felt really good. That's the good part of collaboration. The bad part of collaboration is when it's just like so much back and forth through multiple apps that it's soul crushing. So, at Asana, we just try and focus on how do you make the good parts of that team flow state occur by reducing the noise of the bad parts of the tax of collaboration, and we think we're onto something.
And so what are some like recent concrete examples of what you've done product-wise to kind of encourage that?
Yeah, so we released this feature called Workload. We started out thinking that we needed to build a tool that helped team leads kind of better allocate the work across their team. But then as we dug in, did more research, we just thought that there's a bigger problem around burnout. Burnout is something that impacts probably everybody in this room.
Yeah, who's felt burnout?
Yeah,
okay,
right.
That's everybody then.
So some interesting stats. 80% of us have felt burnt out in the last 6 months. 93% of information workers say that they work harder and are more efficient than their colleagues. So, like that, and like, hey, my favorite movie in the world is Office Space. And you remember that scene in Office Space where Bill Lumbergh stops by Peter's cube and he's like, "Hey, what's happening? I need you to come in on Saturday because I basically misallocated work." And like then he looks over and the person next to them is like looking bored. Like there is actually a real problem of how you allocate work and how to surface what you're doing in a way that could be trusting creating between a manager and an individual contributor and not trust reducing like the Bill Lumbergh conversation. So in Workload, we actually make it very clear to employees on teams and and team leads, like who's doing what, how burdened and taxed are they at any given time. You can actually see the UIs laid out in these waves of like, yeah, in the next week somebody is like really spiking, and the next person has some open capacity. You can literally drag tasks from one person to another to reallocate their work. And when you do that, the peak and troughs of somebody's work life just start to narrow out, and you start to have just more balance, which actually allows people to do their best work and not be in a sort of the fear and anxiety of all those pings all the time.
So on the flip side of that, like it sounds like at core, this and Asana generally are like about transparency, right? Like increasing transparency across the organization. But what about, you've probably heard it from clients, like and working with smaller companies, working with companies that are becoming larger companies, you sometimes encounter a lot of resistance from individual contributors and team members who are like, before I could just go get the work done and it was great and you just trusted me to go ahead and get the work done, and I don't really like this thing where I now have to kind of lay out what I'm doing and make it available for everybody else. And so how do you cross that hurdle with growing organization?
Well, we have one of the highest net promoter scores for a B2B product. So like once people adopt Asana, they use and love it. In fact, like here we are talking about work management, and I asked if there's any Asana users out there, and people are like, woo! Like work management. Well, that's just because like once you try it and you have the chance to experience it, like there is a better way. It's way the hell better than email, which is easy to beat. It's way the heck better than tracking projects in spreadsheets, which is really easy to beat because it nearly works. It's way better than a program project management sort of department, which comes around and taps you on the shoulder to track your status. What if there was a system where actually the work you do just like updates and shares with everybody how your work is contributing to the big mission and and you have a great view into how all the work that's required for you to do your job, how that's progressing. So it's kind of like once you get in it and you see what it can accomplish for you, you get over any hesitations around the transparency start, because the state right now is so poor. I think we're going to look back at all the artifacts of how we work, like we're basically using the same form factor of work as we did 25 years ago, the Microsoft Office suite. We still primarily use spreadsheets, email, documents, and document tools that are really made for printing stuff. Like who prints stuff anymore? So we're going to look back at that stuff and it's going to feel like relics. There's a whole different set of tools, a whole different way that we could work that reduces the back and forth, gets everybody on the same page, uses things like the cloud, and like integrates us as a team in a way to do better things.
You mentioned a lot of legacy tools that probably Asana can replace or other tools can replace. Like what other tools are you seeing that are interesting that are coming up that contribute positively, I guess?
Well, I think Slack could be dangerous, or it could be a great virtue. And I love what I'm seeing from Slack as how they're tackling the issue of notifications as well. Slack generates a zillion notifications, but you can tell by the design that they care about the issue. Have you seen the recent update where they tell you the time, the local time
Yes.
of the person that you're about to Slack?
It makes me think. I usually still send that Slack, but it does make me think.
Yeah, and it allows you also to put up a sign that says, I'm in a meeting, this is not a good time for me, Those sender and receiver controls, those little bits of information, it feels like Slack's onto something around synchronous messaging in a way that other platforms aren't. So I applaud that.
Yeah, because especially synchronous messaging is like very urgent, right? There's an urgency to an inbound Slack message that is like hard to match on any other platforms, including email, which has plenty of its own problems, right? But that does make sense. So I guess then just to get back kind of to some of the reluctance or some of the barriers that you encounter, what about, how do you see the balance between kind of enterprise concerns, enterprise productivity as a whole versus individual productivity? Like you mentioned avoiding burnout. There's a lot of perception that those two things are in conflict with one another, right? Like what's good for the organization might be bad for the individual and vice versa. So how does Asana think about that, and how do you work with kind of companies and people?
I imagine that there are, in the collective time of my lifetime, there are tens of millions of software engineers who burned their time on trying to build enterprise software deployed at scale to drive efficiency, and the user, upon first use and ongoing use, hates it. Like, solving for efficiency just hasn't really worked in enterprise software. There's some notable exceptions, but I just feel like there is a world where you can focus on efficiency and employee engagement. I don't know if you know what I mean by employee engagement, but employee engagement, like often companies have surveys that they send out, and there's some science behind that. The science is your employees are going to be happier, more efficient, and more effective if, number one, they know that what they're doing contributes to something bigger than them. Number two, driver of employee engagement, there's a clearly articulated strategy for management. Number three, that there is a reward structure where when you do the things, you get some light shined on you. Now, like, those are the types of things where that's self-reinforcing, in my view, to efficiency. Efficiency doesn't need to be sort of like tops down, replacing workflows with computers. It actually can be speeding things up because teams like working together more, and you're focused on the things that really drive employees to stick around and do their best work.
So you mentioned that there's a lot of assertions there in terms of like how people like to work. What kind of work has Asana done on finding out those dynamics? Is it all from your customers? Do you have other information?
Yeah, I think from for a company our size, we just have an outsized UXR team, user researcher team, and we spend a lot of time doing observation with customers, like just watching people suffer at work, like watching teams have either like big highs and high fives or low lows where there's dysfunction. And then we pick that apart and we like, how can we help these teams actually get into a state of flow? How can we help them unlock the greatness? And we take note of those things and create our product strategy around like getting teams to work together faster, understand how what they contribute to the strategy is the thing. Make sure that strategy is clearly articulated, and then like make sure that everybody knows who's doing what by when, who's accountable for what, because that just builds trust. Ideally, you'd want teams to want to work together again on the next big thing because they had such a great time together. So that's when I say flow state for a team, it's kind of what I'm talking about.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point to bring up because like flow state, I feel like sounds a little bit sort of out there.
It sounds a little frou-frou.
Yeah, like it's like one of the, it's like intangible, like oh, you come to this thing and it's magical or whatever. But it sounds like that's also not very much. That's not really how you think about it internally when you're like developing the product.
Yeah, I'm a practical person, so I'm also a little cynical. So like terms like flow state kind of turn me off. But there is something unique about how we work. At an individual level, you remember when you did your best work, like when time sort of stood still and you were able to really pour yourself into the thing and you didn't get distracted by the things around you, and what you came out with just felt satisfying? That's kind of individual flow state. Team flow state to me is where like your team has very smooth handoffs. You can anticipate whatever the next person is going to say. You're finishing each other's sentences, and you feel like you have a high trust. Well, I think if you can maximize flow state individually, maximize how that works for the team, you end up with an organization that has high engagement, meaning that folks want to stay. They want to tell their friends about how great a place it is to work, and they're actually more effective. So for me, that's how flow state works at an individual, team, and organizational level. That's kind of where our product management and design teams are focusing.
Great. And is that sort of your guiding principle then? Like anything that increases that sort of value for teams is something that you think is worth pursuing?
Yeah, and, in particular, I spend probably 5 or 6 hours a week doing design reviews with teams, hands-on, and we look at screens and we look for work about work. So if there's something that's behind a tab, like, God, why did you design it like that? That's just work about work to get through that tab. So we're actually focused on killing micro instances of work about work inside our platform, because it should feel simple in flow. Like you should feel like this is a place where you can do some of your creative work and you're feeling the goodness of your team behind you.
And you're talking about like dog fooding, right? Like you're talking about internal Asana, or are you doing, is this with your own stuff that you're doing at Asana as you do product?
Oh yeah, well, like I'm hands-on as a CPO, and I review the designs of our teams all the time. And like when we have a choice between a couple different directions in a feature, we find the one that's like the most simple and most elegant. The other thing we do is we have a culture for 650 people at Asana who hate work about work. Like they signed up because they like this mission. So we use Asana all day, every day. So when you introduce something that's at all takes some more cognitive burden or is a strange choice or difficult wording in the product, we get tons of feedback internally, which is great.
That kind of like spins in then. So what kind of advice would you give to, I guess, product managers or product-focused people here who are looking to increase their innovation capabilities, especially as they get maybe larger as they grow their organization?
Yeah, well, I think there's a great body of work out there in the lean startup, which I have a lot of respect for. Lean startup works for small startups, it works for larger companies, which is like getting really clear on the hypotheses that are the most important to test, the leap of faith hypotheses, figuring out the fastest way to test them, and then increasing the number of tests that you're able to run in a period before you like run out of time or patience. That's awesome. That's kind of like the widely adopted literature of how you innovate at small and large. I think the next round here is just like, how do you kill all the BS associated with the best innovators' work so that designers are designing, researchers are researching, engineers are coding, and product managers are dreaming up big things. So like work about work reduction, particularly in large matrixed organization where you got 13 stakeholders who want to know the result of every particular thing. That's kind of kills, and that reduces your ability to really learn fast.
So then, following that to its natural conclusion, do you get to a point where Asana is completely individual to the users and it just is kind of operating entirely autonomously, since it's somewhat work about work?
I don't know if I think there's still like, it's still powering the creative work of folks, of teams. It's not. I think there's things that we can do in Asana to automate things. Something else that we found that's killer: 10% of information workers' work is repetitive. So like it's something that they did last week, they have to do this week as well. And like we are looking at some ways to automate some things. We have some features coming out in the next couple of months, particularly around like killing off some of the work about work that has to be done over and over and over again. That's the easy stuff to get rid of. But it's really meant to be a tool just to get the best out of folks. And when you do that, folks are happy because the designers can design, engineers can code, and they don't have to go to status meetings.
All right. Thanks very much, Alex. That's all the time we have, but super interesting conversation. Thanks.
All right, thank you.